Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Have you guys noticed something off about the lightsabers in the High Republic period? And no, I'm not talking about the whip thing, although the whip lightsaber hilt is also weird. I mean, just look at how thick these things are, especially compared to the ones we see in the prequel era. So why is this? Well, I actually think Star Wars is finally addressing one of the larger problems with the lore that's existed for a really long time, especially when the expanded universe started exploring kind of the ancient history of Star Wars. You know, the Old Republic period was supposed to take place about 4,000 years before the main Skywalker trilogy films. And if you take a look at the design of the equipment, the ships, the armor, the weapons, they look very, very similar to the Clone Wars period. You have the famous Havoc Squad Republic troopers. Their armor looks almost exactly like the clone troopers we all know and love, and they're fighting these Sith war droids, which look exactly like the droidicas the Seppies used against the clones. I wouldn't blame you if you said that these things looked exactly like what we see during the Clone Wars, especially if you aren't familiar with the Old Republic MMO games. And that's not the only thing that hasn't changed in 4,000 years. If you take a look at ships of the Old Republic era, not only are they visually very similar to the ships during the prequel era, even their performance isn't all that different. Take a look at the R-Class Tactical Strike Fighter. It is faster than the T-65B X-Wing, and it has a Class 2 hyperdrive, something that many Clone Wars era starfighters and the Empire's famous TIE fighter line didn't have. And if you take a look at automobiles here on Earth or airplanes, if you just go back like a few decades, things drastically change. If you go back 100 years, they're not even the same machines really. They're made out of completely different materials. They have completely different performance abilities. In the Old Republic, you also have the famous Ebon Hawk, which is clearly inspired by the famous Millennium Falcon. Then we have the Republic Hammerhead Cruiser, which reportedly served the Federal Navy continuously for almost 3,000 years. You know, the only piece of military technology in our own timeline that served for 3,000 years is probably the mighty entrenching tool. You know, there's no better way to control a bunch of bored hooligans armed to the teeth than by tiring them out digging trenches and latrines. That's one thing that hasn't really changed in thousands of years and probably never will change. But when it comes to ships, I mean, even in the Star Wars universe, designs change every few years, so this really doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, look at how different the Republic Navy during the Clone Wars looked when compared to the Empire, and that happened in under a decade. You're telling me the Old Republic used the same ships for 3,000 years? Now, we've made videos in the past trying to understand why everything was so stagnant during the Old Republic period and why there seems to be more changes in designs and performances between the prequel and the original trilogy technology than there is between the Old Republic and the prequels. We theorized that maybe continuous war and conflict just kept on destroying civilization, forcing the inhabitants of the galaxy to rebuild and recreate technology. Most of this was caused by the Sith and Jedi trying to destroy each other. I mean, during one period of time, like right before the Ruusan Reformation, the Jedi and Sith were essentially fighting each other with mostly melee weapons. Kind of sounds like that famous quote always attributed to Albert Einstein. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. I mean, one of the Jedi during the pre-Ruusan Reformation period had a starship that looked like a freaking galleon. In their defense, this period of time was known as the Dark Ages of the Republic. There was like unprecedented amounts of dolphin activity all across the galaxy. But anyway, this is probably why the Lucasfilm story group was created, because of nonsense like this. Like, the captain of that galleon boat was literally a Goatman fawn. They called him a half Bothan, but this looks way too high fantasy for me.
Hey, give me back my sock, you goat bastard!
The Lucasfilm story group not only tried to rein in excessive, crazy things, like Goatman, but they also wanted to create a consistent timeline. They're basically like the TVA from Marvel. They wanted to keep the holy timeline intact and get rid of variants. In the expanded universe days of Star Wars, you had all sorts of contradicting storylines. There's also this problem where Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Chewbacca were just everywhere. Like, they were in every story, every battle, every quinceañera. I mean, how much stuff can one character do in a lifetime? Right. Now, on the flip side, while the Lucasfilm story group did make the canon a little easier to understand, it also limited the creativity that individual writers were allowed to bring to the universe, for better, but oftentimes for worse. I truly feel like high-level directors and talented writers are turned off by the idea of like a holy order of monks that, look over a sacred timeline of sorts. But then again, Tony Gilroy seemed fine with all that and was able to work with them to create Andor. Now back to the weird technological stagnation of the Old Republic. From a production point of view, I believe this was done because a lot of these artists and creators didn't want to deviate too much from the original Star Wars aesthetic. That's basically a crutch I feel like a lot of creators lean on, unfortunately. Star Wars is so goddamn popular with such a large baked-in audience, you either use that or risk pissing them off by giving them something new and different that they potentially might not like. Now, I've noticed in recent times with the High Republic, they've attempted to create a more believable kind of transition of technology and infrastructure in the galaxy, which I think is really a good idea because the 4,000-year gap in the technology makes no sense. There seems to be some pretty noticeable differences in technology in the centuries between the High Republic and prequel era. Now, some people might think that the High Republic era looks more advanced in a lot of ways. I mean, look at the robes, look at the architecture. Well, I would argue in the same way that some might perceive Renaissance artwork and architecture to be superior to modern day designs, the High Republic was just a very beautiful age, a gilded age where literally excessive amounts of gold was everywhere, including on the robes of a lot of these Jedi. But if you take a closer look at the technology they used, it's a bit older, less advanced. There really is no advantage, for instance, in making the hilt of a lightsaber much larger, and you see, especially in the hands of smaller combatants like Jeki, these weapons look relatively hard to grasp with your hands. It's very likely that the components for lightsabers during this period of time were just larger and had not been miniaturized to the degree that they were during the prequels. Think about how much smaller and more efficient and more powerful semiconductors are now compared to back in the day. Computers that used to be the size of a room had a lot less processing power than modern day tablets or even smartphones, which can fit in the palms of our hands. They don't even have as much processing power as all of these birds being employed by the government. Now, lightsabers don't have semiconductors in them. They're actually relatively simple from a technological standpoint. It's just that they're designed with internal mechanisms and connection points that are very hard to assemble and put together unless you have the Force. The kyber crystals themselves also haven't decreased in size, but the power cells like the Deladium batteries used in most lightsabers could have definitely become more efficient. I mean, the first proto sabers in Legends came only in a yellow color. It didn't matter, what color you wanted, you got yellow. That was it. Plus, you had to lug around a giant battery pack on your hip that was connected to a cord. I imagine a lot of lightsaber techniques involved cutting that cord, right? But yeah, clearly the High Republic lightsabers are a little more advanced than that, but I don't know if you've noticed an interesting thing about these lightsabers. Because they were bigger and thicker, it also meant that most Jedi fought using more simpler forms. Now, of course, there was also like a change in the culture on how, aggressive you want to use the lightsabers because there's a lot of peace, but take a look at these lightsabers. They're not only thicker, but they're also longer. I mean, these things look like substantial rods, kind of. And so if you take a look at the average High Republic Jedi, a lot of them look like knights wielding giant claymores. A lot more Jedi used a two-handed grip for the defensive and offensive strikes. I mean, Jeki in that duel with Chimera using Jar Kai was probably a rarity during this period, and perhaps this was a homage to Anakin versus Dooku in Episode 2. Everything about this period to me screams medieval knight combat style rather than the samurai style we're more used to during the Clone Wars. It's like the difference between Baylan Skoll and Ahsoka Tano in their duel. One's all about power strikes, large movements, efficient movements, and the other one's all about speed and flash. Another interesting technological advancement would be the stun blaster. The thing that Yorg was so eager to use on Chimera. Imagine if he actually did stun him and then they brought him back to Coruscant. That would have been awkward. But yeah, this thing looks more like a flintlock blunderbuss pistol. I mean, it's so large that it needs a shoulder harness and strap. Within 100 years from now, we know that there will be much better and streamlined stun weapons. I mean, take a look at the DC-15 carbine used by the Clone Army or the E-11 that was used by the Empire. These things served primarily as lethal blasters, but they had a stun setting as well. I imagine a stun blaster requires a lot less energy than an actual, lethal blaster rifle. The technology for stun rounds became so miniaturized at one point that they could even fit into the hilt of a lightsaber, like Ezra Bridger's lightsaber. Now, it is possible that this is just a special blaster for the Jedi because they would never use a lethal blaster. Okay, let me reword that. They would never have a lethal blaster in the loadout, right? But this stun gun really looks like a prototype of some kind, something that the Jedi technicians put together in the lab that was just not built for, mass production or anything like that. Talking about mass production, a lot of the ships of this era look a lot more handcrafted and artisanal than like kind of the mass-produced starships we see during the Clone Wars, because of course those are mass-produced weapons. And the reason is because there's no military-industrial complex, or at least a military-industrial complex of the same size that we see during the Republic era. And of course, when the Empire takes over, it's all just military-industrial complex everywhere. Another huge leap in technology that we see in the prequel era when compared to the High Republic era is the advancement of communications and hyperspace travel. A lot of early High Republic stories reference the Great Hyperspace Disaster, where a near collision in hyperspace caused by the Nihil Marauders sent essentially FTL speed pieces of debris to multiple Outer Rim systems, killing millions in the process. The Nihil Marauders had something known as a path engine. These were specialized hyperdrives that worked on a far more advanced technology than what the High Republic ships tended to use during this time period. The Nihil's path engine gave them more flexibility on where they could jump to. They could do micro jumps and all sorts of things that just were impossible, and gave them a huge strategic and tactical advantage against the High Republic and Jedi. Although the Nihil's path engine technology and their unique ways of traversing hyperspace was more or less lost, their use of hyperdrive rings would later be adopted by the Jedi and the Republic Navy. Most ships in the High Republic Navy could only travel at FTL speeds through predetermined hyperspace routes, and there were far fewer routes back then than compared to the Clone Wars era. And actually, a lot of these routes were controlled and sold by hyperspace prospectors like the Santeca family. That's how they got so rich. Now, the centers of the galaxy, the areas around the core had plenty of different hyperspace routes that made traveling around pretty easy. But in the Outer Rim and the peripherals, there are only a few well-surveyed routes for ships to travel on. It makes it much easier for bandits and pirates to basically waylay you. And so the Republic was really desperate for more hyperspace paths, and these had to be carefully planned out. You had to take into account planetary bodies and how they moved around, because even though hyperspace travel happens in another dimensional plane, mass that existed in real space also exists in hyperspace, and as we see with the Holdo maneuver, when things collide at FTL speeds, it can cause a whole lot of damage. Now, in more modern eras, you have advanced astromechs, who can take a look at existing star charts and make calculations for jumps. Larger ships have navigation computers that can do this task as well. And this is a Herculean task, mind you. In Legends, the R2 series of astromech droids could only hold like 10 sets of hyperspace vectors. And that was only the second variant of the R series. The R1 was much larger and wouldn't necessarily fit into an astromech slot. The C series astromech, which was also developed by Industrial Automaton, was developed around the same time period as well. Which means it's very possible that during the High Republic era, you didn't have astromechs being slotted into smaller starfighters. You only had them on larger ships where they would help with maintenance or hull repair. Now, not all hyperspace surveying and exploration was privatized. Chancellor Lina So, during the High Republic era, actually passed a very, bipartisan-friendly infrastructure bill. So you call it the Great Works Project. She would build the Starlight Beacon Station in the Outer Rim, which would serve as not only a base for Jedi peacekeepers, but more importantly, it served as a navigation beacon and also a communication hub for the Outer Rim. As we see in the Acolytes after the incident on Kofar, Jedi Master Sol has some serious communication issues with Coruscant. You see, the great distance between planets also posed a significant challenge for comm signals. Just because communications travel on energy waves doesn't mean that they don't have to, cross massive expanses of space. And so along with the invention of hyperdrives, we also saw the creation of S-threads, which were kind of these mini hyperspace tunnels through which communications could travel through. This allowed the Jedi to communicate with individuals across the galaxy almost in real time. They could also stream their, favorite shows on the HoloNet. The Jedi and the Republic also had to deploy Pathfinder teams who were responsible for setting up new routes as well to new member states. These teams explored new routes by using the Force and also using micro-jumps. They usually worked with communication teams that would set up relay buoys that would help strengthen the larger communication network. They're basically like AT&T and Verizon and your, local utility companies, except they also had to fight like aliens and marauders and stuff. I imagine the healthcare benefits were pretty good. Another initiative that was a part of Lina So's great works were a network of more powerful communication relays built on planets. Together, these would greatly expand the communication network for the High Republic, which will allow for more travel, more communication, and of course more commerce. The chancellors of this period also attempted to create more economic and technological partnerships between various member races. They also tried to broker peace between certain species like the Mon Cal and the Corans. They always seemed to hate each other for some reason. It was during this time period that Bacta cultivation would finally be perfected, creating a very valuable commodity that was basically a miracle cure for most ailments. And so, as you can see, during the High Republic period, because there wasn't constant conflict, I mean, there was some conflict here and there, but an enlightened political philosophy that was really built on economic growth and scientific research helped, create a lot of great things for the average citizen in the galaxy. This is truly a golden age for the Republic. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.